You notice one thing generally, the men and the women are closer together in African countries than in Arab countries. And inasmuch as the prophet's first public act at a time when, because they are a desert people, when a woman had two girls, if the third child was a girl, they either got rid of her or put her to death. Women protested this. He defended their right to keep the children. Now, inasmuch as the prophet defended their right to keep their children, one wonders why and how, over the years, systematically, Islam became predominantly a male chauvinistic religion. Here you have to separate Islam from Arabism. Maybe it was something about the desert, and maybe it was the belief that a woman needed protection. But very few women rose to high position in the Arab side of the religion. And I can name one woman head of state in the black side of it who not only headed a state, but rode in the head of her army and commanded her armies in the field. 1500s, that's Elmina of Nigeria in the state of Zara. I recently recommended that she be included among Budweiser's great queens of Africa. And I purposely supervised the writing of the copy in order to eliminate a whole lot of the misconceptions about her. And they are misconceptions and rumors. The rumor was, because she never married, is that she took a new lover each night, and if his performance wasn't adequate, she had him killed in the morning. There was no proof of this at all. And if that rumor got out, I guess half of the male population in the world might disappear. Even stars don't perform at their best every night. So that wasn't an important thing anyway. The important thing was this strong woman defended it wasn't Nigeria then, it was in the Hausa country. The state of Zara defended her state and built walls of defense that still can be seen in this part of Nigeria, defended her right as a woman without getting into the nonsense about liberation, held her ground, defended her lineage, and left her mark on that territory of Africa until that part is a part of Nigeria that is literally called Elmina's city. And she was a Muslim. And that did not happen any other place among Muslims for women. That did not happen. It surely did not happen any place among the Arabs. And the revolutionary African, especially revolutionary against colonialism, happened nearly always on that side, on the African side. That meant that the African accepted the religious side and the spirituality, and that Islam said something to the African that it did not say to the Arab, and that it still says something to the African that it is not saying to the Arab. That if Islam is to be rescued and made the great spiritual and moral religion it was intended to be, instead of the political instrument for opportunists, it will be the African who will make it so. He has the capacity to make it so. And this is what we need to look at, not to ignore the Arab at all, not to ignore the fact that it was from Arabia that the religion came out, swept over into North Africa, and had its rapid growth. All right, now, after this religion barely got underway, the prophet had some difficulty, had to leave Medina, then literally had to fight his way back to Mecca. Bilal was with him all of the time, and so was Zayd bin Harith. Zayd bin Harith was the governor of the Prophet's tribe, the Quraysh, and he was married into the Prophet's family, one of the highest honors possible. And he is hailed as one of the great heroes of Islam in the Encyclopedia of Islam and other literatures of Islam. The literature of Islam writes about the great blacks, but they don't tell you they were black. And what we need to do is to do a little more research in the area of Arabia and the presence of so many Africans at the time. We need also to look at the number of African neglected heroes in Islam and bring them back to fore, bring them back into world consideration, and understand that Islam came into being so fast. It is literally a religion made from a composite religion, and the least original of the world's religions. It had to take something from Christianity, something from Judaism, something from Zoroastrianism. That is nothing that one needs to apologize for. And yet, it came into being at a time. It served a great purpose. And it had to turn to many places for haven and for shelter. On the advice of Zayd bin Harith and Bilal, some of the key followers were sent to Ethiopia for shelter while the trouble in Arabia blew over. The prophet said, "Go to Ethiopia, go to that land of righteousness where no one is wrong." This is the kind of reputation Ethiopia had among Muslims. At the time, it had been a Christian nation for over 300 years. Other people against the move went ahead and told the Ethiopians that these people were thieves. And when the Ethiopian king received them, he said that your message is not much different from the Christian message. And he received them and sheltered them until the difficulty blew over and they went by and strengthened and got the faith well underway. Now, Bilal stayed with the prophet the rest of his life. And when the prophet was dying, he literally appointed Bilal as the next caliph. And he refused it. Now, look what would have happened to the faith had Bilal became the next caliph after the prophet. It would have been a different religion altogether. But he refused the honor, but he did not call the prayers except 2 more times. After that, he called the prayers for Omar, the first caliph, and 1 time for a special meeting for the first caliph. And then he either went back to Ethiopia or he died. We know Zayd bin Harith died in a battle against the Byzantines. But these 2 Ethiopians had helped to lay the foundation and the strength for Islam. Islam now was ready to move out of Arabia over into North Africa, to move into the vacuum left by the confusion of the Romans and the mismanagement of Christianity. North Africa was in such a sad state that the people were ready to welcome almost anything with the disappearance, with the wreckage left by the Romans. So there was very little resistance. In a little while, the Muslim armies had swept across most of northern Africa. A little resistance from the Berbers. These are relatives of the Arabs who had arrived much earlier. And this resistance didn't last too long. When this resistance died down, Islam swept into the Western Sudan and began to convert Africans. Now, Islam swept into the Western Sudan. Understand me now, if you can visualize a map of Africa, they went down into West Africa, not the coast, but inland away from the coast. That is called the Western Sudan, skirting the coast. And they converted a group of Africans. And these Africans became purists. So much purists that these Africans, after 50 years or so, came back into Morocco and told those who converted them, you are not properly observing the faith. I'm purer than you are. Now, you have to understand this, because Western Africa, the Western Sudan and Western Africans were converted by Islamized blacks. East Africa was converted by Arabs. Islamized blacks knew what part of African culture to leave intact in spite of Islam. You can see the difference to this day. And East Africa, converted by the Arabs, who had no respect for African culture then or now, they destroyed a lot of African culture. They married African women, and after 50 years, they had produced enough black-looking Arabs, and ultimately they would use them to go inland where the Arabs were not permitted to go, and start the East African slave trade over 600 years before the European slave trade. And the Arab is the only aspect, a branch of Islam to use Islam as an aspect of slavery. Now, the Africans who converted those in Western Sudan left the matrilineal system intact, meaning the lineage coming down through the female remained intact in Western Africa, while in Eastern Africa, the Arab installed the patrilineal system, meaning the inheritance comes through the oldest son and the lineage come down through the male side of the family. It has wrecked the culture to this very day. It has confused the culture to this very day. Now, when they arrived in Egypt, they arrived at a culture that had been raped by foreigners for 1,000 years. They had no respect for it or understanding of it then. They have no respect for it or understanding for it now. The Arab traditionally has no respect for non-Arabic culture, and practically none for African culture in other parts of Africa. And this is the basic drawback and the basic difference between Arabs spreading Islam and Africans spreading Islam. African Islam is basically different from Arab Islam. Arab Islam is a form of Arab supremacy and condescension. Just like white Christianity is a form of white condescension. They think they're doing you a favor to let you in their church. The church becomes their private property, just like the Arabs think they're doing you a favor when you come into one of the mosques. And if you go to Mecca and see the discrimination against colors, different colors, you will find that out is that even in Mecca, there is color discrimination. And they'll look you straight in the eye and deny the whole thing. All right, now, they're in Egypt. But out of the Western Sudan would come a great general, Tarak Ben Zad, Jabral Tarak. He would discover a weakness in Spain fighting the Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals fighting among themselves. The dissident element in Spain would do something white people rarely ever do. They would sneak across into Africa and tell the Africans how weak the whites are, and said they are so weak, if you want to conquer them, it's an easy thing to do. Jabral would send a testing army, about 10,000, just to test their lines. You find it is easy. Then later, he would send 60,000. He'd take Spain. Now, this is purely an African conquest. You are not dealing with the Arab conquest of Spain at first, because the Arabs were not there at first. The initial conquest of Spain was African, not Arab. That army came from the Senegamia, now Senegal, and parts of what is now Mauritania. And when they moved over and conquered Spain, Madame Bagiba has written a book on it that bears the name Tarak Ben Zad. The Rock of Gibraltar is named after him. It's the hill or the mountain of Tarak. Gibraltar is a corruption of his name, Jabral. And she describes the army going into Spain. She says the army was black as ink. The general was blacker still. Meaning the general was the only one riding a white horse. So his blackness against that whiteness looked blacker than the rest of them. But the horse was better dressed than the kings of Europe, with silk and brocade. And the women taking off garments and throwing him in front of his horse, waving. Let me be the foot. I'd like to see Hollywood put this in Technicolor. Militarily, the Africans took over Spain, and militarily, the Africans held Spain until 1240, while the Arabs did come in. But the military hold on Spain was African. Now let's look at the Africans and the Arabs, that combination called Moors in Spain. What did they do? What did the Africans give to Islam? Why do you find a toleration between Christians and Arab, Christians and Muslims in Spain that never existed before ever? It is the African spirituality. They coexisted with the Catholic Church side by side. They worked out a humane agreement. No mass killing. They built public schools. They built public baths. There's a chapter in John Jackson's Introduction to African Civilization called Africa and the Civilizing of Europe. You would do well to read it. That chapter alone is worth the price of the book. But there are many other books on the Africans and the Arabs in Spain. They gave Spain the greatest civilization it has known before or since. They built a great university, Salamanca. They translated the great works of the masters of Europe, including a lot of works they had stolen from Africa. Europe had forgotten its own masters. The Africans translated it. It was the African that suggested that the Jews be appointed to the chairs in the mind sciences. God, what an error. All the ideology chairs. It was the Africans who took the Jews into Spain and made them the grandees, the money managers of Spain. And when the Africans lost power, some of them went Holland and found the Dutch East India and the Dutch West India Company and became managers of the slave trade. People find no compunction of turning on us when it's their convenience to do so. But their performance in the partnership between the Africans and the Arabs and the Berbers in Spain was a long and beneficial partnership and a fine moment in their history and in world history. The African and the Arab and Islam had united and held Europe at bay for almost 1,000 years. And when that partnership went bad, both of them were in trouble. By 1450, the Africans and the Arabs began to argue among themselves over nonsense at first. But 1240, the Portuguese had broken away from the Africans, but Spain was still under their domination. Then half of Spain, for 1455, had broken away the Castilian part. And now they had colonial aspiration of their own. And they went to the Pope to discuss the matter. He was the leading authority of the world where Europe is concerned. Now, they wanted a piece of the world. They wanted to start dividing up the world among themselves. And the Pope told them, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. In other words, you need not feel guilty about the slave trade that had already started along the coast of West Africa. The fact that there were great independent states inside of Africa is something I'll talk about later on. My main point here is that Islam had swept down into the Western Sudan. That a lot of people said the great states of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were Muslim states. Ghana was never a Muslim state. In fact, Ghana was destroyed by Muslims. By Abu Bakr of the Susus. When he pulled his army out of Ghana to help his co-religionists in Spain, he died. Now, I'll be talking about these other states in more detail in another way. But what I'm concluding with is that the spread of Islam into the Western Sudan had brought a language, a sense of accounting, and a religion that had a fascination for the African. But now, the argument between the Africans and the Arab, spoiling the performance they had, that almost 1,000-year performance that had been good not only for them but good for mankind. They had given North Africa some stability, and they had given the Western Sudan some stability. It came 1492, and the least significant event would be the so-called discovery of the New World. The greatest event in the history of that period would be really the Africans and the Arabs, collectively called Moors, would lose their hold on Spain and be pushed out. Be pushed out of Spain, and they would lose the Mediterranean. They had blocked Europe in the Mediterranean. They had forced Europe out of the Mediterranean, and they had forced Europe into the Middle Ages. Now Europe had discovered longitude and latitude. It had come out of its box. They'd gone back to sea. They had learned some maritime techniques from the school at Salamanca, that the Africans had translated the information from Spain, and they would turn on the very Africans who translated it for them and the very Arabs. The fight between the Africans and the Arabs would facilitate the rise of Europe. But except had the Africans and the Arabs got together at this point in history, fighting over various interpretations of Islam, they could have stopped Europe and stopped the slave trade, but instead of stopping the slave trade, the Arabs went into the slave trade, disgraced Islam, disgraced themselves, and left the African without protection, something which we should never forgive. And after this, the Africans, mixed Africans, Berbers, and Arabs in Morocco, sore heads, turned inward on Africa to rob the nations to the south. They recruited European mercenaries with modern weapons for that day, and with some guns supplied by Queen Elizabeth I, they invaded the Western Sudan, destroyed the great state of Songhay. And the long night that was to last 500 years had started, and the good that Islam had done was being spoiled. Now you had Muslim against Muslim facilitating the spread of the slave trade inland. I am saying that while this is one of the world's greatest religions, its redemption is going to come from Africans who will rescue it, give it a real meaning, make it a world religion, make it a world force for unity, and give it the sense of tolerance and respect for other cultures and religions that it once had, and integrate it into the concept of African culture and African liberation. Either do this or throw it into the ash can of history. Thank you.
Dr. John Henrik Clarke.